Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Appointment with Death from 1988. Now, for frequent viewers, you may recognize this more readily, despite its name, as another Agatha Christie movie adaptation. I was curious, not knowing that this even existed prior to watching Death on the Nile, what this one was like. As we discussed during that video, Peter Ustinov portrayed Hercule Poirot about a half dozen times. I think in addition to in addition to Death on the Nile and this movie, there are 3 or 4 other movies, 3 of which were made for TV, I believe, and I think there might be one other that is a theatrical release. This is the last one, and as far as I'm aware, also the last Poirot adaptation for cinema up until the 2017 version of Murder on the Orient Express. Anyway, so I wanted to see different production company, different story, different budgeting, different director, different producers, and many years later, I think 10 years later, do I have that right? I don't know. I don't have the list in front of me. How does this compare to Death on the Nile? Given my sort of hesitation to recommend Death on the Nile, it should be somewhat illuminating to say that I don't recommend this one particularly favorably either, or I don't see it particularly favorably. It's not without some improvements, but we'll get into it. This video, well, I don't want to curse it. This video might be a little bit shorter because a lot of the complaints I have about Death on the Nile, I also have about this one. Once again, I don't love Peter Ustinov's portrayal of Poirot. He's not bad. He just doesn't have a lot of character. He's a little bit too sort of amiable and personable, and just not very Poirot-like, at least in my mind. I don't love his portrayal. It's inoffensive. It lets he's more approachable for a viewer who doesn't know anything about Poirot, but it dulls some of the uniqueness of Poirot as a character, and that's basically the same as it was in the first movie. Again, we have a problem with plotting and the story overall. And now, having watched a few of these, I'm coming around not to feel differently, but to think differently about some of these, and to realize that much of the failure, in my mind, is not due to a lack of content in Christie's original novels, nor is it even a matter of a poor screenplay that's just butchered the original novels to the point of unrecognizability. It's mostly a matter of characterization failure, and that is in small part due, at least in this case, to some of the actors. In many ways, it's just a matter of poor translation of the prose into cinema. Now, I could get into a long conversation about tone and how you adapt the feeling of prose into cinema. Lord of the Rings is one of those examples that I've talked about on a number of occasions before, of how the Lord of the Rings movies are an extremely good adaptation, not just of the content, but of the tone of the books. And I'm realizing that so much of what is missing in these films is it's not for a lack of attempt to characterize people. It's that Christie's writings, of which I've mentioned before, I have limited but some experience with. So much of the content, and I think this is true of many in the mystery genre in general, much of the writing content and the appeal of the prose has to do with how the inner workings of characters' minds are portrayed, either directly or indirectly, whether that's a point of view character who is expressing their personal feelings, or the minutia of just descriptions of behaviors and the little quirks of what people do. And I feel like in possibly all of the Poirot adaptations, yes, including the TV, there is often a failure to translate any of that to screen. Now, the TV show, which I've mentioned before is my preferred adaptation, gets away with this a lot more by one, having usually less content to fill, but also less time to fill, but also having Poirot be a bigger character and more of a through line between episodes, between mysteries, and that with him being more of the focal point, that it's a very strong adaptation by comparison, because it takes the burden off of some of the burden off of the scriptwriters and off of the individual actors in an episode to flesh out their characters a ton and have the adaptation much more leaning on Poirot as an interpreter of the world, which is less congruent with how Christie's writings actually work, usually. So I'm rambling now, but my point here is that there's a lot of characterization. Rather than doing any characterization at all, they seem to largely, in some of these scripts, have basically forgone it completely. And it was less obvious in Death on the Nile, and even less obvious on Murder on the Orient Express, but it's explicit here that these are largely characters who are extremely tropified, because any attempted nuance of character is just not possible for the number of characters required. Well, I don't want to say not possible. I've seen it done. I've seen movies, I think I've talked about movies on this show, that do an ensemble cast of 10, 15 people and make them all into interesting, deep-ish characters, deep enough that, they get their whole character across in 10 minutes and yet are a convincing person. But largely that does not happen in this film or some of the others. They are mostly reliant on tropes, on stock characters, and Christie in particular has some very stock characters that are very common. It is not unique to her by any means. It is not even unique to the era in which she was writing, and that's not to say that as far as her competitors at the time in terms of the mystery genre in general and British, anyway, I'm getting off on tangents upon tangents. Stock character is not inherently a problem, but they can be used to get a lot of information in a little amount of time. But if you just drop a stock character into a work, and you don't give them unique characteristics or a portrayal that is engaging in its own right, they come off as extremely flat and not engaging, and more like furniture than anything else. And I'm going to use that as an awkward segue into some of the problems with the production. Because in addition to a bunch of these, well, okay, let me talk for a second about the casting. The casting is a lot weaker than in the prior two films. I already talked about Peter Ustinov. I've got my feelings about him. Interestingly, Lauren Bacall, who was in the Murder on the Orient Express film with a different Poirot, is in this film playing a kind of similar character, not crazy similar. She's actually it's weird because she's playing a similar character, but a different stock character from Christie's typical list. She has switched places essentially with another character from Murder on the Orient Express, but is acting like a different character. Anyway, she's solid. Not really a lot to say. She's doing the best she can with the script that's there, and there's not a lot there. A lot of the other castings are rough. Poirot's friend, the character who's playing his local friend and confidant and whatever, is pretty weak. Basically, all of the other main characters are reasonably weak. Carrie Fisher, I don't have really strong feelings on as an actor. She has her ups and downs. Definitely, I think her acting is more reflective of the quality of the script than most. She's got some excellent performances. She's also got some really bad ones. This one, she actually does stand out as a bit better than some of the others, but she's not beating Lauren Bacall, and she doesn't have much to work with. So she's not awful. Some of the others are actually quite bad, but she's not awful. She's just meh. But to get back to my point from a couple of minutes ago, a lot of them, because of the way they're characterized and also the way that many of them are acted, they feel like scenery. And unfortunately, speaking of scenery, the scenery also sucks. This movie is, I hesitate to say ugly, but the production values are far, far lower than they were on either of the prior two films. And I don't know if that's actual, like, money-wise, what the budgeting looked like for the films. But there are really no interesting shots compared to Death on the Nile, which used a bunch of footage that, while I complained about how much time it took up, was still nice footage that they took of these places, these locations, versus this one, which is mostly nondescript areas, vaguely reminiscent of, well, except at the beginning they use some stock footage, which is weird as well. Anyway, there's corners cut all over the place in this production. It's not pretty, and generally, in terms of its cinematography and its production value, like, there doesn't appear to have been a particular artistic vision on this one. Now, say what you will about the other two, but they at least usually had some sort of consistency in their color grade and their cinematography and the way things were framed and shot, and the camera movements and things like that. This film is really all over the place. It occasionally is like splashes out to do something interesting in cinematically, but it comes off like a film student who just learned about, some film techniques and wants to try them all out. Scene to scene, the quality of the sets and even the lighting and just stylistically, there's no visual through line other than being, set in these various places in the Middle East. And even then, it's I actually don't know if they even shot anywhere other than maybe Britain or the US. They easily could have done, I think, pretty much everything with a combination of stock footage and sound stages. I think so. Now I'm racking my brain to think if there's anything I missed, but doesn't matter. It's just visually not very pretty. It's disappointing, to say the least. So yeah, not very nice. On the upside, for all of the same failings, the same failings it had about Death on the Nile, and the new failings it has, it is shorter. It's 40 minutes shorter, and that is a welcome change, because if this movie had been 20, 30, 40 minutes longer, it really, really would have sucked. The pacing is better. It's not good. It's still the sort of like meander for 50 minutes and then have the investigation for 50 minutes, which I don't think is a good pacing. But in terms of the tempo of the film, it moves at a better clip. It is much more judicious about its use of your time. And I think I'm not going to give them too much credit for that. I imagine some amount of that is accidental, as a matter of we just don't want to shoot more footage, which that's my pet theory. But I have nothing to back that up. I mean, it's nice that it's shorter. It doesn't make it particularly great. That said, it's inoffensive as an adaptation of a Christie work. It's not great, but it's probably not going to offend anyone. Most of my gripes about it are about kind of limited cinematic value and questionable adaptation of the source material. You can certainly waste your time on much worse films, but I can't recommend it either, unless you are, like me, just kind of curious how these various adaptations turned out. If that's your cup of tea, if you're like me, then sure, go for it. But I'm not going to give it a high recommendation of any kind. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. This might not go up in order, actually. It's going to be funny. Well, no, that would be silly, because then I wouldn't have the reflection point. Anyway, I may watch if I can get my hands on the other Ustinov Poirot cinematic release, I might watch that one. Or I might not watch it at all, or I might not record about it. I'm not doing the TV movies, but I might do that one if I can find it. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.